There was a yellow cinder block farmhouse that sat on 20 bucolic acres in northeast Oklahoma that was home to a family of 6. It was the height of summer in 1965. The stalks in the cornfields that surrounded the house were laden with grain, and the evening summer breeze that rustled the sheaves wafted through the sheer bedroom curtains of the open window leading into the bedroom of the 3 young boys that slumbered within. This steady zephyr imbued the room with the fragrance of honeysuckle, while a choir of distant night jars whistled monotonous, ceaseless melodies, and the night deepened around them. Keith rolled over in his twin bed. He was 8 years old. His brothers, Lynn and young Eric, were lost far away somewhere in dreamland, as evidenced by their deep, rhythmic snorts and wheezes. Lynn was an asthmatic, but it was clear by his respirations that he was in no particular distress at the moment. He had taken 2 puffs from his adrenaline inhaler before retiring, as was his routine, and the drug was obviously hard at work on his bronchial passages. Keith had momentarily awakened from a bad dream, which served as the impetus for his unrest. He caught a whiff of the honeysuckle and began to fall back once again into the chasm between consciousness and slumber. But just at that moment, he thought he heard a voice. It was a far-off moan, barely perceptible. He thought he was dreaming, returning to the nightmare from which he had just awakened. Bloody bones! Bloody bones! It was a mournful, eerie howl. He sat straight up in bed, sure that he had heard it coming from out beyond the cornfields. He jumped down and ran to his parents' bedroom, white with fear. "Mom! Dad! There's something outside! A man is yelling, 'Bloody bones!' Can I sleep in here with you?" Keith was trembling. His parents could see that he was visibly upset. So the 3 of them walked into the boy's bedroom and listened through the darkness. The moonless night offered little evidence of anything but the sound of the breeze through the pitch-black landscape. "Keith, it's just the wind. Go back to sleep. We'll have to stop letting you watch Twilight Zone if this keeps up." Mom's whisper was stern but reassuring. They tucked Keith back into his bed. Mom waited until Keith had settled down before returning to her own bed, proud of her comforting role as a good parent. The next morning came and went for Keith, though he couldn't forget the night before. He stayed close to the house most of the day, but in the afternoon, he and the family cat, Old Tom, ventured out past the cornfield where the woods were heavy. They happened upon a dead chicken, one that Keith was sure was one of their Rhode Island red pullets, laying against the trunk of an old post oak tree. It was barely recognizable, but appeared to have been half devoured by some wild animal. It had been disemboweled, and many of its bones had been ripped from the carcass. The sight of this dead bird and his bloody bones rekindled his fear from the night before, sending him running full speed back to the farmhouse. Night would soon be falling. Mom had dinner ready when he got home, out of breath and preoccupied with what he had just witnessed. He barely ate anything at all, fearing what might come when forced to go back to bed for the night. Mom seemed to sense this, and when it came time for bed, she was sure to tuck him in with assurance and a kiss. She wanted to make sure that his nightmare from the night before wouldn't fester into some sort of neurosis. Keith asked one last time if he could sleep with Mom, but she said good night with a final kiss. The night was again upon them. The sound of Lynn's rhythmic, asthmatic wheeze had started long ago, and young Eric had already said at least 3 garbled sentences in his sleep while acting out whatever dream he was having. Keith lied transfixed in his twin bed with the covers up over his nose as he peered toward the open window. This night seemed darker than the previous night, and the pervasive breeze only added to the trepidation Keith was feeling. Surrounded by his brothers, yet alone in his torment, his nightmare was about to be brought to fruition. Bloody bones! Bloody bones! This time the words were clear and much closer in proximity. It came from just outside the window, so close that he felt any move to escape would be detected by this unknown nemesis. Then, with all the courage he could muster, he bolted from his bed straight to Mom and Dad's room across the hall. "Mom! Dad! He's just outside the window! Hurry, Dad, and you can get him!" Keith was more insistent, so much so that Dad grabbed his gun and ran toward the boy's bedroom, turning on lights as he went. Dad had been given a pistol by his felonious brother. He had used it in one of his many armed robberies, and he had given it to Dad for safekeeping until a time when he could reclaim it and continue his life of crime. He would ultimately die a free man of a heart attack at 47, just a few days after getting out of prison. The other boys had now awakened with excitement. Even the baby Alicia was crying. Dad ran to the bedroom window and stuck his head out, looking for the intruder. The grounds were silent. The dog, Major, wasn't even barking. Everything seemed in order. Only the breeze persisted in the darkness. Dad turned around, a bit perturbed by the way Keith had carried on. "Everybody back to bed. No more of this foolishness, young man. Do you hear me?" Dad was upset. Mom remained silent and stayed to ease Keith back to sleep. She always knew Keith was a child of imagination and was a little more empathetic in dealing with him. She stayed for more than an hour, stroking his hair and listening to the chorus of wheezes and silly utterances emanating from the other 2 boys. She rose to leave, but the realization of her impending absence invoked such alarm in Keith that she picked him up and carried him into her bedroom. Keith would sleep this night in his parents' bedroom, safe from the terror hidden outside his bedroom window. The morning sun shone brightly on the yellow farmhouse. The family was at the breakfast table enjoying the pancakes that Mom had made. Dad didn't say much. He was thinking more about the chores he had to do around the house than the events that had transpired the night before. Keith was uncommunicative as he picked at his plate, looking up when Eric objected to Lynn stealing the last piece of bacon from the plate in the middle of the table. The commotion seemed to amuse Alicia as she sat in her high chair cooing between spoonfuls of the applesauce Mom was ladling into her messy mouth. Dad looked up threateningly, and the dispute was over as quickly as it began. Keith walked outside and called for old Tom. He was fond of that cat. Old Tom was just that, old. He had a big sore above his eye, and Mom had said that if it didn't heal, Dad would have to put him down. That meant a .22 caliber bullet to the head. Keith didn't like thinking about it. Usually, when Keith called the cat, it would come running. But this morning it didn't. He ventured around the yard searching for him. He went out to the pump house, looked out by the wood shed, and finally walked out behind the smokehouse. There, he found him. The cat was a bloody mess, just like the Rhode Island red hen that he had seen the day before. It was a tough pill to swallow for Keith as he took his old friend out to the garden and buried him by the tallest fence post. He wasn't sure why this had happened, but knew that his life would never be the same. Whoever and whatever had done this would have to be held accountable. The third night was now upon them. The boys were brushing their teeth, getting ready for bed. Eric had to laugh as he watched Lynn furiously working his toothbrush in and out of his mouth. The same toothbrush he had clandestinely dipped into the toilet in retaliation for the bacon incident earlier at breakfast. That was part of Eric's passive-aggressive nature. The fact that Lynn had no idea why Eric was laughing made it that much funnier to him. He would get to laugh again when Lynn reached for his inhaler, the same one that Eric had spit on 2 hours before. But Keith had no time for games. He didn't even know how much time he had. He just knew he didn't want to go to sleep. Lynn and Eric plopped into bed, and on cue, Lynn reached for his inhaler, eliciting a knowing snicker from Eric as he pulled the sheet over him. Mom came in and tucked them in, giving Keith an extra kiss as she turned away and switched off the overhead light, leaving them in the smothering darkness. The only solace available for Keith was the baseball bat he had under his bed. The room was still, except for the familiar wheeze and intermittent babble of his brothers. There was no breeze this night, nor were the night jars singing. There was only Keith, awake and alone, underneath his sheet, beginning to sweat with the heat of the warm night. And then, a voice. It wasn't a voice from beyond the cornfields. It wasn't a voice from outside his window. This time, the voice was loud and threatening, stentorian in tone, and coming from inside the room. Bloody bones! Bloody bones! The strident voice filled the room, rousing both brothers from their slumber. The three boys sat up in their beds, paralyzed with fright, as the creaking hinge of the bedroom closet door announced the presence of the intruder. Eric, meekly and timidly, mustered a nervous query. Whose bloody bones? The three boys held their breath, awaiting the reply. Yours! Bedlam erupted inside the bedroom. The boys bolted blindly for the door, but Eric ran squarely into the entity, who now stood squarely blocking the only exit out of the room. Eric screamed as the man's cold hands clamped down on his arm. Keith grabbed the bat under the bed and ran toward the intruder in the dark, unsure of where to swing or what he'd hit. He could hear Lynn gasping for air as the chain of events had precipitated an asthma attack. He swung the bat blindly with all of his might and connected squarely on the head of poor Eric. Eric dropped to the floor, barely breathing. Lynn and Eric were both incapacitated, leaving Keith alone in a fight against his enemy. And now it's your turn. The voice was determined and evil as Keith began to backtrack. The intruder moved toward him as he cowered on his bed in the corner, alone with his bat. Closer and closer, he drew toward the terrified child. Keith's heart was leaping from his chest as he could feel the wickedness closing in. He was close enough now to smell his awful breath, and with all the courage he could bring forth, he swung the bat, only to have its inertia stopped by the villain's calloused hand. He flung the bat across the room, barely missing Lynn, who was clutching his chest, lying feebly on the bed. Just then, the bedroom light flickered on, and a shot rang out, sending the intruder sprawling on the floor between the beds. Dad stood in the doorway, clutching his brother's smoking gun. The ordeal was over. Mom ran into the room and grabbed Lynn's inhaler and put it to his mouth. He was gasping violently by now, but in the few moments after the drug was administered, he began to recover. Eric, too, had regained consciousness, albeit with a big lump on his head. Keith was the calmest of all, as his personal vendetta had been fulfilled. Then, Mom made her way to Keith's bed, smothering him with all the pride and love his bravery merited, stroking his hair, uttering his name. Keith. Keith.
Keith.
Keith. The scene began to fade as the warmth of the early morning rays of sun roused him back to reality. He glanced over at Lynn, snoring as usual. Young Eric was at his bedside, prodding him to consciousness. Eric's forehead slowly came into focus. There was no sign of the blow he had received from the intruder. He sat up with a start and looked between the beds for any clue of the nightmare that he alone had witnessed. His ball bat lay undisturbed under his bed, with old Tom stretched out on the cool floor next to it. Could it have only been a dream? His epiphany brought mixed feelings of relief and disappointment as he got up to enjoy another summer day, free from the weight of his childhood imagination. The story of bloody bones would be recounted endless times in the Adams family household over the years. Each time it was told, the family gathered around and listened in earnest, and Dad changed the ending each time. Surely, it's a story that the children will tell their children and will be enjoyed for generations to come.